So thus far we've looked at two sections of the UCAT test, which were the verbal reasoning, and then we spent 2 weeks looking at decision making, which were all those different kinds of sort of logical puzzles and things. So there's one more section of sort of intelligence testing, for want of a better word, that we're going to look at. And then there's the situational judgment, which is a bit different. That's kind of about probing your attitudes rather than your sort of how good you are at problem solving. But the third of the sort of intelligence tests is called quantitative reasoning, and it's basically data analysis. So that's what we'll have a look at now. So what they do is they just give you data either in the form of a graph or just a table of numbers and ask you to calculate various things. So there's no really complicated maths involved, but it is all just simple maths and number wrangling, basically. But you can see again, it's going to be about speed because you have to do 36 questions in 26 minutes. You've got about 3/4 of a minute per question. It's not quite as bad as it sounds because although there are 36 questions, that doesn't mean you've got 36 separate sets of data because each set of data has 4 questions attached. And that means that, you know, it's a bit like with the verbal reasoning ones, that after the first question, they get a bit easier because you kind of know where the information is in the text. And it's the same with these, that after you've done one question, you kind of know where to look in the table or on the graph or whatever. Even so, it's the usual story that it's about loads of practice because you've got to get fast at these things. Just to make life difficult, you can't use your own calculator in the actual test. So they provide you with this on-screen calculator that looks like that. So it, you know, it was the state of the art in 1981 or something like this, and it's very kind of clunky compared to possibly the calculators you use today. In particular, if you tend to like putting long, complicated expressions into your calculators, tends to be physicists, you know, who like to do the whole calculation in one long string of things, and you can't do that because it doesn't have any brackets. So you have to do each little calculation a bit at a time. And I said it doesn't follow BODMAS. You probably remember BODMAS, which is the priority in which you do operations. It does kind of do it, but it's not. It doesn't always do it depending on which operations you're using. So it's things like if you put 2 + 4 × 3, then you probably remember, or you know if you do maths, that 2 + 4 × 3, you do the 4 × 3 first and then add the 2, so you get 12 + 2 is 14. But on that, if you do 2 + 4 × 3, it will do 2 + 4 is 6 × 3 is 18, so it'll give you the wrong number. So you have to do each little step one at a time. And so long as you get used to that, it's okay. But otherwise, obviously, if you kind of assume that your calculator doesn't lie to you, you're going to come unstuck. Okay, so the things that are slightly better than it seems though is that you can use your keyboard to input the numbers, and you can use the enter button as the equals button and so on. And that's going to be much quicker than using the actual on-screen keys. Okay, so we're not going to use that this morning because it's just too difficult in a PowerPoint thing, but as soon as you start practicing, that's one of the things you need to practice, is getting quick with this. Otherwise, you may find this to be a horrible race against time just because of the calculator rather than because of the questions. Okay, so here's an example of one of these questions then. So here it's given you data in a graphical format, and it's just asking you a relatively simple question. So there are going to be 4 questions on this data set. So see what you make of that one. What's the answer? Yeah, so that you hopefully found a relatively easy one, and that in the test would hopefully have been like a 10-second question to give you time for the more complicated ones that come later on. Because really all you have to do with that one is notice that on a Sunday, the easiest one is to notice that almost half of the things sold were newspapers, okay, because it's 40-something% were newspapers. So you just look for the pie chart that has almost half of the circle shaded in blue, which is C. So that's a nice, easy one to start with. It is the next one. You feel free to use your calculator if you want. I mean, I don't think you probably need to for this one, but in any of these questions, you would have your calculator there. So. Any suggestions? Sorry. D. Anybody disagree? Good, right. Yeah, D is the right answer. So for that one, you look at the Wednesday column, which is the third one, and you can see we're talking about sweets, which is the red band. You can see it goes from 15 to 40%. So 40 minus 15 is 25% of the sweets are, of the things sold as sweets. So in other words, a quarter of them. And it says 280 altogether, so it's just a quarter of 280, which is 70. So D is the answer. So with that one, it's a good example of what you have to decide is whether you want to rely on your mental maths ability or whether you think it's going to be safer for you just to plunge in all the time with your calculator. I mean, that one, the mental maths involved wasn't terribly difficult, but if you know that you're a bit error prone in mental maths, or if you think there's a risk that you'll start trying to do it and then realize that you've got lost, you may decide that it's better just to plunge in straight away always with the calculator. And that's a decision you have to make nearer the time, but it's about making sure you don't waste time sort of taking one approach and then jettisoning it and needing to do something different. Okay, so D was that one. This one. Okay, so answer for that one is B. Yeah, good. So that one, I think, I mean, you're not going to do the mental maths fully, although you could use it to do it as a sort of estimate and home in on the nearest answer. But I think it's an easy thing to do on the calculator. So you just say, if you got 15% fewer things sold this year, that means you've only got 85%. 100 minus 15 is 85% last year. So you just 0.85 times 2,480 gives you 2,108. So again, that's quite a quick one. And this one. So what's the answer for that one? Yeah, okay, so you've got a split difference of opinion, is that right, between D and E? Well, the answer is actually E, that you can't tell, because those numbers, remember, are not the actual amount sold, they're just percentages of the total amount sold. So if you're looking at sweets, you might sort of look at it and say, right, Saturday looks like the one where the biggest proportion were sweets, but he might have only sold 3 items on a Saturday and sold 1,000 on each of the other days. So actually the number of sweets would be smaller, even though the percentage is bigger. And so that's where you've got to be a bit careful. Whenever you get can't tell as an option, it's by no means always the right answer, but it's always important to think, is there some trick here? And the trick there is realizing that if you're only given the percentage, it doesn't tell you the actual numbers. And there's no reason to expect that they would be the same every day. So therefore you can't tell. Okay, so that's what you get for each data set, for quite different kinds of questions like that. But at least it gets a bit quicker as you go through, because you're kind of used to the data set by then. And then you get the shock of something totally different. So let's see what you make of that one. Okay, so any suggestions for that one? C, okay, anybody disagree? Nobody disagree? You really want to disagree? Okay, well, let's go through it. So actually, you did quite well, because C is almost right. C is very much a falling at the last hurdle situation. So what you correctly did is realize that if you compare the ingredient list with the shopping, yeah, okay, so then the only tricky bit is that you've got to double the minced meat, because you need 2 packets of that, and then you just add up those things for stage 2, which comes to £18. And actually quite a lot of people go for 18 because they forget that it's per person anyway. But then it says 3 friends round for dinner, so you divide by 3. But unless you have strange dinner parties in which you sit there and watch your 3 friends eat while you don't eat anything yourself, there are actually going to be 4 people eating. That's the tricky part. Okay, so that was a nasty question, because of course, if this was a maths question, it would have been 3 marks and you'd have got 2 out of 3. But here you get nothing, because it's just right or wrong. So that was nasty. Yeah. Okay, so percentage difference in a packet of cheese in shop 3 compared to shop 1. Okay, so suggestions for this one? 25% is B. Anybody disagree? Anybody tempted by E? No, I mean, B was right, but I just wondered, because I mean, that's usually the thing. So, because you have to be really careful with the wording in these questions. So, what you do is you look at the difference, because that's what it asks for as percentage difference. So you just look at the difference in cost in shop 3 compared to shop 1, which is 60p. And it says express that as a percentage of, because it's compared to shop 1. So that's as a percentage of £2.40. So it's a quarter, and therefore it's 25%. If it had said, what is the cost in shop 3 as a percentage of the cost in shop 1, then it would have been 125%. Because you've got to make sure you read the questions carefully. And obviously you've got to just double check and make sure that because it's compared to shop 1, so that's your reference. So if you've got 20%, it's because you were referring it to shop 3 rather than shop 1. So there are lots of mistakes you can make if you don't read the question carefully, but so long as you do, that was straightforward. Okay, so the answer for that one. A, yeah, because it's 90 pence for a lettuce in that shop, and you just want 90 pence as a fraction of £20. So that comes out as 4.5%. And again, you could do that in your head, or you can say, right, I don't want to risk that. I can just go in and do it with the calculator. But that was a straightforward question, so relatively quick. Whereas this one's more interesting. Okay, any suggestions? A, yeah, A is right. Well done. So that took a bit more thinking about. In particular, you had to make sure you read the waffle at the top that gives you the distance to shop 1. One thing I always used to notice when I taught chemistry was that people were very reluctant to read the waffle at the top of the question. There would always be, oh, let's get to the, to where the numbers are and the questions are. And sometimes they bury key bits of information in the blurb at the top. So make sure that you don't fail to notice that. So you had to know the distance to shop 1 is 15 miles, and it tells you that it is 20% further. So 20% of 15 is 3. So that means you add an extra 3 miles. You've got 18 miles. And then you're going at 54 miles an hour. So 18 is a third of 54. So it'll take a third of an hour, which is 20 minutes. And therefore the answer is A. Okay, so that one, once you've worked it out, you think, oh, well, that was relatively straightforward. It was only 3 little steps, but I think it took more to see your way through that one. So you can see that this guideline of, approximately 3/4 of a minute per question doesn't really mean very much, because some of them are going to be quicker than that, and some of them are going to take longer. But none of the ones that we've dealt with so far have sort of had really sort of big numbers that are going to take a lot of calculator work, but sometimes they do. So here's an example where there are trickier numbers, and there's also a little bit of algebra to do. As you can see, you've got that little formula at the bottom that you're going to need to use. Okay, so have we got an answer for that one? A, anybody disagree? Right, so the right answer for that one is D. So let's see how you get to that one. The key is that you have to think about that rating definition at the bottom. Right, so how did you get A? Did you just...
There's a total number of people that tuned in, so those two numbers have got to 5, 6, 7, 5, 4.
Right, yeah. So that sort of seems to make sense, but the point is that we know that there are these other services that you could tune in via, which are the Cindy's and others. And you have to think, well, what about those? And that's where the formula at the bottom comes in, because those figures in the table, it tells you are ratings. And you can see that using that definition at the bottom, you can turn the ratings into an actual number of people who tuned in. So given that formula at the bottom, what do you have to do to the ratings number to get the actual numbers that tuned in? In other words, can you rearrange that little formula to get the number of audience tuned in? You do. That's right, yeah. So it's about making sure you can rearrange things. So again, it depends how much maths you've been doing. I mean, if you're doing, I assume everybody's doing chemistry. So you get to do this all the time in chemistry, where you have to rearrange, concentration is moles over volume. So what does volume equal? It's the same kind of thing. And you've just got to make sure you can do that. So you get that the number of in the audience tuned in is rating times audience population divided by 100. So that means that if you take those two numbers, those two ratings, you've got 2 plus 2.2 is 4.2. Is your rating, multiply that by the audience population, so multiply by 13,500 and then divide by 100. And then you add that number to the other two that you suggested, and that brings you to 1728. So there's that written down if you didn't quite follow that. But the key to it was recognizing that that formula at the bottom is there for a reason, and that it lets you make this conversion between this bizarre rating number and the actual audience, which is what you generally care about. So that was quite a lot harder than either of the previous questions, I think. And you might think, oh, that means that the rest of the ones for this table are going to be easier, but I mean, actually, they're not particularly. And that's the problem with all these tests, that the level of difficulty is quite uneven. And so if you know that you're likely to struggle for time, it may be that when you get to something like this, if you struggle to do that first one, you might think, okay, let's just look at an easier data set. This is going to take too long. Those are the kinds of decisions you have to train yourself to make. Okay, but let's have a look at what else they expect you to do. Okay, have we got an answer? Yeah, E was the right answer for that one. So this is now a lot easier having done the first one, because you've got used to the fact of what to do with that ratings definition, because it's the same thing. So you look at Cindy's for program 2 and it tells you that the rating is 3. So you again use that same rearrangement that you've already done to work out the actual audience level for that, just by multiplying by 9,400 the audience population and divide by 100. And then it says 24.8% are female, so that leaves 75.2% were male. So you just find 75.2% of your number and you get 212. So again, it's definitely a calculated job, but it was a lot easier having done the first one, because you've now used to using that rating definition. Okay, and then this one. Okay, so this time you've got to go the other way and turn some of those actual audience figures into ratings, so that you can incorporate them with the other ratings to get the overall one. So what's the answer? 2, yeah, so E was the right answer for that one. So this is the working. So what you've got to do is to work out, say for program 1, what the rating is from those network and cable numbers. So you just use the definition at the bottom. If you add those numbers together, 756 plus 399, then divide by the total, which is 10,500 times 100, gives you a rating of 11. And then you add that to the other two ratings, which gives you a total of 13. And you do the same for program 2 and you get 15. So the difference between the two is 2. So there's a lot of calculating and there's a lot of making sure that you use that definition of the rating correctly. And you see the problem that if you hadn't got to grips with what the rating meant, you were going to get all 4 of those wrong. So that was the key. So don't ignore bits of information unless you're really sure that it's irrelevant. Okay, so first 2 questions, relatively manageable. I think that one would have taken longer. And so that's why it's important to be quick on the easy ones so that you've got time to do the difficult ones. So I looked through all the questions in their past question data set, and pretty much all of them, the only types of data that you need are either just graphs of various kinds, bar charts, pie charts, line graphs, or tables of data. But the one thing that I just wanted to check people had come across is sometimes they do these cumulative frequency graphs. Does everybody know what those are? Or do you want me to? Did you all do that in maths before? Okay, so that's what this one is, and it does tell you it's. Does it tell you it's? No, it doesn't actually. Oh, it does. Yeah, it tells you up the side it's cumulative frequency. So see if you can answer that question then. What's the answer? Yeah, B is 3 is the answer. So if you look at class 1, which is the blue line, you can see that it carries on rising until you reach 3 countries. So that means that because it rose from 2 to 3, that means that some people had visited 3, but not 2. But it then doesn't rise anymore. So no people visited more than 3 countries, and therefore 3 is the maximum. If it had asked that about class 2, you can see that it keeps on rising all the way to 4. So the maximum is going to be 4 in that case. So that's what you've got to make sure that you're used to cumulative frequency things. And again, I think, it's one thing to think, oh yeah, we've done that at GCSE, but it's just about getting back up to speed and getting used to looking at the data again. You don't get a lot of them, but you do get some. Okay, so B was the answer there. So that one. Okay, so that one is 4, yeah, so that was D. So again, it's just about realizing that the number that have been to exactly 3 countries is how much did the graph rise between 2 and 3 countries. So it was 24 people was the cumulative frequency. So in other words, the number who'd visited 0, 1, or 2 was 24, but that's gone up to 28. So the difference is 4 people. So you can see, comparing this with the last one, so long as you're confident about cumulative frequency, these questions take a fraction of the time. And so sometimes the sensible thing is when you've got a table with big complicated numbers to say, right, I'm going to skip that one for the moment and go through and see if I can find some really quick ones like this. Because just psychologically, apart from anything else, you know, these questions, once you're confident about cumulative frequency, you know, are literally 10-second questions, and you're going to feel so much better than you think, well, I've already got some in the bank, and then when you go back to the more complicated ones, you don't get so stressed. Okay, so this one. Yeah, so it's one. So if you're asking how many people have been abroad, all you do is you look at the number that haven't been abroad. In other words, the number who visited 0 countries, and you can see that it comes out as 5 for class 1, but 6 for class 2. So the difference is only 1. Anybody spot the flaw in the question there? It's the wrong way round, yeah. Okay, because it's actually 1 fewer have been abroad in class 2. So this comes from the UCAT data set, so you know, it shows they're not infallible in their question setting, but the answer was right in the sense of the size of the difference, but they actually got it back to front. Yeah. And then the last one. Okay. Questions for that one? B6. Oh, D, sorry, right. Okay, 14. Anybody disagree? Yeah, no, 14 was right. So for that one, you look at the number that had visited up to 2. In other words, that's the number on 2 countries, and that's 22 for class 1, and that's 22 out of 30. So that means you had 8 who visited more than 2. So you've got 8 from class 1, and then the same thing for class 2. 24 had visited up to 2, so 30 minus 24 is 6. Therefore, visited more than 2. So 6 plus 8 gives you 14. Okay, so again, you need to look at those and think, if you're thinking, I'm a bit rusty on that because that wasn't very obvious to me, then obviously you need to look at some of these questions. But I think you can see that once you've done that, that was a really quick question, and that would have made a big difference to you. Okay, so I think that's all we're going to do on quantitative reasoning. So as in all of these sections, speed's what you need, and that takes practice. But that calculator especially needs practicing. So the UCAT data set, when you do those questions, it uses the actual same framework that you'll use in the real exam. So you get to use the calculator there, and it's important to do that and not to think, oh, I can't be bothered, I'll just do it on my calculator, because actually that is probably the thing that slows you down the most, is using that on-screen calculator. As always, using the whiteboard to scribble stuff down. And you saw for several of those, you know, like the dinner party one, it's the tricky wording. You've just got to think carefully about what it's actually asking you. So people who do maths and things, or you know, often do quantitative stuff, tend to think, oh, that's going to be an easy section, and think I won't spend a lot of time preparing for it. And that's a mistake, because there's a big difference between being able to do it and being able to do it quickly. So even if you felt confident in those questions, you had much more time this morning to do them than you would have in the real thing. So still going to need practice. But equally, people who hate maths tend to look at this and think, oh, this is the one that's going to mess me up. But actually, because it's just learning to do specific tricks, most people end up doing fine on this section. And sometimes people surprise themselves and get their best mark on this, even though they thought they were essentially enumerate. So that's, again, an important message, because it means it is worth putting the time in, because you will get there. Okay, so those 3 sections that we've looked at then, they mark essentially numerically, and most universities will then add up the total mark from those 3 sections, and that sort of headline number is for many of them what determines whether you get an interview or not, or that combined with your GCSEs. Some of them do something slightly more sophisticated. So because the evidence suggests that verbal reasoning is a better predictor of how good you'll be as a medical student than the other ones, which isn't saying much, because the other ones have essentially no predictive power at all, and verbal reasoning has very slight predictive power, so they're all pretty much rubbish. But because the verbal reasoning is slightly better, some medical schools weight that more highly, and so that can make a difference when you're choosing, because even if your overall score wasn't great, if you had a brilliant verbal reasoning score, that will at some places make the difference. But the 4th section, which is situational judgment, which we'll come on to now, is different, because it's about, it's more subjective, because it's about what would you do in this particular situation. So there isn't a sort of absolute definite right answer. What you're looking to do is to agree with what they think is the best thing to do. But obviously that's not the same as a calculation where there's, it's either clearly right or wrong. And for that reason, they don't mark it in the same numerical way. What they do is, for each question, essentially look at whether you absolutely agreed with what they thought, or whether your answer was kind of close to what they thought, or whether it was far away, and add up those numbers. But in the end, rather than give you a numerical total, they just put you in a band. So band 1 means that you agreed with them most of the time, in which case that's good. Band 4 means that you almost always disagreed with them. And they have total faith in their own judgment. And so if you always disagreed with them, they'll think that you're a terrible person, and therefore you shouldn't be going to medical school. So you've got to avoid band 4. And for many medical schools, that's actually all it is. So long as you avoid band 4, in many places it doesn't make any difference. But a few places really think that they want the band 1 people. And so again, it's worth putting effort into it, because, for example, if you get band 1, it's pretty much impossible to go to Nottingham Medical School unless you get band 1, just because of the way they score things. So takes a bit of work. But the other reason that situational judgment is worth spending time on is that because you're looking at sort of ethical dilemmas and stuff like that, it's really good preparation for the kind of questions you're going to get at interview. Because once you get to that stage, that's pretty much what they ask you about. Okay, they don't expect any knowledge of medicine or dentistry, so they don't ask you questions about medicine at interview, and they don't ask you questions about the science you've been studying at A-level, unless you apply to Oxford or Cambridge, then they do. But everywhere else, all they ask you about is basically your people skills, and a big chunk of that are exactly the kind of questions you get here. What would you do in this tricky situation? So situational judgment is sort of worth preparing for doubly for those reasons. So we'll just start looking at that today, and then we'll carry on next week as well. So 69 questions in 26 minutes is a very fast pace, but the idea is that what they want you to do is to just write down what you think, when you read the situation, and then what your immediate instinct is. They don't want to give you time to sort of spend ages agonizing over it, because they think that what they want is a snapshot of what you instantly think. So what you've actually got to do is to train yourself to instantly think, not like you actually think, but like they think you should think, if you see what I mean. In other words, you have to train yourself to think like they do. And if that isn't how you really think, then, nobody's going to know. Okay, so here's an example then. So okay, so you can see it takes quite a bit of reading through, but you're going to get 4 questions on this scenario. So again, once you've read it through, you can then very quickly go through the 4 questions. And they basically come as 2 types. There are the ones like this, which ask you how important is it to take these things into account. And I think these questions are particularly useful as preparation for the interview ones, because obviously the thing here is in the end, all you've got to do is just tick A, B, C, or D. But in an interview, you've got to talk it through. They're not interested in what conclusion you come to so much as your thought process and how you get there. So these kind of questions are quite useful because they sort of show you that what you've got to be able to talk about then is what are the important considerations. So what do you think they want you to say for this one? So do you see any in favour? What would you actually think in real life? I mean, I bet most of you would secretly think A, wouldn't you? but obviously that's not what you're meant to think. Okay, so what they're exploring here is this idea that as a medical or dental professional, you're supposed to put the interests of others ahead of your own interests in all circumstances. And it's hard to do that completely in real life, but that's what they're looking for here. So it's going to be C or D for that reason. And what you'll often find is that it's quite difficult to decide which of those is true. So what I tend to find is that you can usually decide whether it's an A-B question or it's a C-D question. But the difference between minor importance and not important, very important and important, can be quite subtle. I have to say I disagree with them in quite a lot of these questions. So you'll find preparing for this annoying. Because in the other sections, you may get questions wrong, but you're not going to sit there thinking, well, they're just plain wrong. I mean, because, you can't argue with the maths or whatever it is. But in this, of course, you can. And sometimes, you go through and you look at their explained answer and you think, well, that's just nonsense. But you just have to hope that that only happens a minority of the time. They went for D in this one. So they said, because this idea that you act in the interests of others rather than yourself is such a sort of key principle that you say that's absolutely not important at all. What would happen was if you put C down, they would give you they don't tell you what the marking system is, but I'm guessing it's something like you get 2 marks if you put D, 1 mark if you put C, and no marks if you put A and B. It's going to be something like that. So you get some credit for being in the right ballpark, even if you're not, there's a sort of shade of difference there. Okay, so same scenario, another question. So now you've read it through once, you've got to decide very quickly. Okay, so what do we think for that one? Yeah, A is what they said for that one. Because the view they take, again, these explanations I put there are basically paraphrasing what they gave as their rationale rather than what I thought necessarily. But conscientiousness, in other words, prioritizing completing what's expected of you in your course when you're training or in your job once you're trained, that's considered to be hugely important. So you get a lot of questions about, you know, is it legitimate to skip a lecture for this reason or that reason or whatever? And the answer is nearly always no, because they expect you to be ultra conscientious. And so in this case, from Dominic's point of view, you know, getting a grade that he actually deserves based on the work he's done is a really important part of it. So they put that as an A. Right, so now second scenario, it's a different scenario, and this time it's a different kind of question, because you can see instead of the how important are these considerations, it's now saying, well, you've got to do something in this situation, so how appropriate would these responses be? I found this one quite difficult to know what they would think. So much so that I can't actually remember what the answer is. So it'll be a surprise to me when we fix this in a minute. But what did people think? You said B. Anybody? Okay, so we're all at the top. Anybody at the bottom end? C and D. Okay. B was the right answer, appropriate but not ideal. So well done if you got that. I think if you got A, or probably if you got C, you would get some credit, but none for D. So I think the reason it's in the top half is because always the emphasis is on the needs of the patient come first. And obviously you are trying to meet the needs of the patient by asking that question. So I think that's why it was appropriate. But their view is that in some ways the bigger issue is that this doctor seems to be neglecting their duties towards the patient, and you're not doing anything to deal with that, and that's why it's not ideal. So yeah, it's quite tricky, but I think you can see that whenever you get questions which sort of come down, at least in part, to are you putting the interests of the patient first? If the answer is yes, then it's likely to be in the top half of the answers, because that's one of those sort of key principles that you need to follow. Okay, so another question on the same scenario. So what do we think for that one? C or D? Yeah, so it's going to be in the bottom half. You've got to take account of the fact that Finley is a medical student and he's talking to a doctor, so someone considerably more senior than himself. So you get that tricky situation where you're not supposed to sort of dodge difficult issues. In other words, you're not supposed to say, well, I can't say anything critical to them because they're an important doctor. That would be bad. But equally, you've got to show respect. So you can't sort of just say things like that, which, you might say to your 4-year-old child or whatever, but you don't say it to your consultant when you're a medical student. But also, I guess you're kind of making assumptions there because it could be, for example, that the doctor isn't the only person who could be contacted and someone who isn't on their lunch break might be available. So in other words, you're making assumptions that it's their fault because there isn't enough information there. So they decided the correct answer was D, both because it's lack of respect and because you don't have enough information to be sure that they really should be doing this thing. I mean, I really don't like this section. I think those shades of grey in terms of, should it be C or D are often really difficult. But the good news is that people very rarely get band 4 in situational judgment. And as I say, so long as you are sensible in choosing your medical school, so long as you can avoid band 4, it shouldn't massively mess you up unless you've got very specific medical schools in mind. But as I say, even though that's the case, it's worth putting lots of effort into because if you get band 1, it really helps you in a few places, but most of all because it then enables you to think it in a way that they're going to approve of when you get to answering questions at interview. Okay, so I think that's all we're going to do for this week.